Now that you know something about the history and significance of social science, we need to talk a little bit about how social science actually happens, the research side of things. How do we know what we know? Well, as we go through our everyday life, we all observe the world around us. We all look at the people that we see and interact with every day, and we might come up with some theories of our own. But are we being scientists? We have to be very careful in the way we look at the world around us, because we often forget how small a sample of the world we're really looking at. We see only a very small selection of people in a very large world, 7 billion people in the world, or thereabouts these days, and we tend to see people who are very similar to us much of the time. And those who are less similar to us, we may interact with so little that we have a very skewed sense of what they're actually like, what their life is like, etc. We are based in our own culture. We tend to be ethnocentric, which means just centering on our own culture, our own way of doing things. And we can be very biased based on our cultural assumptions and our own experiences. So the kind of prejudice in our general worldview that we all tend to have is what leads to stereotypes, unscientific generalizations about social groups, the kind of unscientific theory about what, say, for instance, men are like versus what women are like. Even that simple observation that we do every day can often give us evidence against these kind of stereotypes and some of the common sense assumptions that our cultures make. For instance, you may see some women who aren't particularly feminine in the classical sense, and you may see some men who aren't particularly masculine in the classical sense. But you also probably see some men who are very traditionally masculine and some women who are very traditionally feminine. So with all these conflicting observations, how can we really be sure of anything? How do we know that what we are understanding about the world is based on what's really happening and not our own assumptions? We use the scientific method. We examine all of the available evidence, and we gather that evidence in ways that other people can repeat. And as we're looking at evidence, we need to analyze it fairly. We need to look at what's happening regardless of what you want to be true or what you think already is true. One of the key things about the scientific method is that you actually have to pay even more attention to anything that goes against your hypothesis, what you assume to be true. In science, we make theories that others can disprove, and it is in that you can say you've truly come up with a good scientific theory, an idea of how something in the world works. It's something that someone else can disprove, can show evidence to say, no, this isn't the case. So Emil Durkheim, Emil Durkheim, one of the early classical sociologists, said, the way to study society is to study the social facts, things that we can directly observe, record, and or maybe count. Things that are concrete, that I can look at, record an observation, and you can look at and record the same observation. So we can look at, if you want to talk about what men and women are like in society, we can look at shopping patterns. Are there certain things that men tend to buy more than women, or vice versa? We can look at crime rates. We can look at specific behavior. What we can't look at, what we can't observe and record, each of us, different researchers recording the same thing the same way, are things like the soul, things like divine intention or human nature. These are abstract concepts that are not readily observable, that aren't recordable. So sociological arguments need to be based on facts, not on what you, your family, or your religion believes to be true. The scientific method happens in a series of basic steps, and they're not always necessarily in this order, and often as you proceed through the process, you will find you have to go back to the beginning because something has changed in your understanding. But you basically start out by defining a problem. You say, this is something that we want to know about. This is something that we see as a problem in the world that there isn't a ready understanding of. We look at what has already been written, what's already understood about that problem. We formulate a hypothesis based on that. So what do you think is actually going to happen? Knowing what you know now, what do you think is actually going on? Then you go out and you do the research itself. You gather new data, and you analyze data. You look at the evidence, and from that you can develop a conclusion. Emil Durkheim, again, in one of his most famous studies on suicide, he said, why do people take their own life? He looked at what was known of suicide rates for different European countries, and he found that they changed from country to country. And so he maybe made a hypothesis. I don't know what his initial hypothesis actually was, but it could have been that poverty causes suicide. I mean, that's logical, right? You're struggling, you're having trouble getting work or feeding your family. Perhaps it leads you to not want to go on living. But when he actually went out and he did the research, what he found was that the highest suicides in each country were among unmarried people, soldiers, atheists, and wealthy people. And in the final analysis, he had to find what was the common thread among these groups. And he found that they're all groups of people who are separated from others. So you may think, poverty is a hard way to live, and maybe you wouldn't think life was worth living. But people in poverty often are driven together. People in poverty need each other to get by, whereas wealthy people, who you'd think have it much better off, why would they kill themselves? They have the financial ability to be independent from each other, and so they often find themselves in solitude. Atheists and actually even Protestants had higher levels of suicide, and he theorized that that was because they were separated from the Catholic Church. They didn't have as strong a community to be a part of. Soldiers are separated from their families and sent off to war, and unmarried people have no one to go home and tell their troubles to. So his conclusion was that it's that isolation that's the biggest cause of suicide. People need each other. In natural science, we're observing and recording data on physical objects, and in some ways, that's a much easier thing to do. Because if I drop a rock, I know how that rock is going to fall. I can pretty much predict exactly what it's going to do as long as I know enough about that rock. People have hidden processes. Much of what they do goes on inside their brains, and even with modern scientific understanding, our brains are extremely complex, and we don't know that much about how our actual conscious processes happen. We can't observe someone's thoughts directly. Even asking them, we only get their own interpretation and, in fact, what they are willing to say. Unlike a pair of rocks, which could be almost entirely the same as far as the physics go, there are no two people who are exactly the same. We are all unique. And there are 7 billion of us, and all of us interact with one another across the world as well as in the same room in a multitude of tangled, complex ways. Furthermore, in studying people, we are studying ourselves. Even social scientists are people, and we have our own biases, our own cultural assumptions. We have cultural values that tell us what's good, what's important, what's beautiful. This leads us to assumptions. It leads us to prejudices. It leads us to bias. Bias distorts the evidence, and it may lead you, like here you see all of the evidence of stones weighed up on one side, being still outweighed in the minds of a researcher by his own biased desire or assumption that this one piece of evidence over here is the one leading to the correct conclusion. Max Weber, who we talked about before, he said, a social scientist has to be value neutral. We need neutrality in the values of our research. We can't be coming from our own assumptions about what is good and important, about what is true. But since, of course, we all have our own assumptions, we all have our own mindset in the world, we have to understand other people. That's where Verstehen comes in, that meaningful understanding of other people's perspectives. Because only by understanding many perspectives can we put the puzzle together and understand the whole picture. So what does it mean to study objectively? Pretend you're an object, like a camera. A camera only records what happens, not what it thinks about what happens, not what it wants to happen. We record the facts as we see them.